This is the second part of the work that we last week we did on suffering in terms of the theological side of it. I'd just like to go over that a little bit again and remind you of where we got to with all of that. So. If I can just do a brief review of last week's stuff, it would look something like this. Got God up in the sky there, and you've got your average Joe. I've put him with a Puritan hat because it was the Puritans who in particular got worried about all this stuff. And you had various possibilities, which we were looking at last week. They would be, I rejoice to suffer for Jesus Christ. Well, that you're the winner, okay? You're one of the chosen. You're doing okay. Your suffering is going to purify you, all right? So that when you go into heaven, you're going to be, when you die, you're just going to be ready to go off to heaven, okay? Here you go. Here's a set of the prints, and yeah, so that would be the ideal situation from the early modern Protestants' point of view. But then there'd be other people who are saying, well, I suffer, but I don't rejoice. I just suffer. When it hurts, it hurts. It's not much fun about it, nothing to get excited about. So that person is going to be told, well, you're not one of the chosen. All right, your suffering is just a taste of what you're going to experience in hell after you die. Get used to it. Okay? Not a very pleasant message to be receiving. And then there'd be the person who says, well, I rejoice, fine, I have a lot of fun. I basically enjoy life. I rejoice, but I don't suffer very much. Basically I'm a happy guy and I have a happy life. Well, again, the message from God is, well, it's because I don't consider you worthy. You're not good enough to suffer for me. All right, so you can have your life of pleasure, but after that, you're going to suffer an eternity in hell. So tough luck, boyo. Okay, so you got it bad from that point of view. And then finally, you've got the poor person who doesn't suffer and doesn't rejoice either, but basically kind of depressed and miserable. I'm not actually suffering. I'm not in pain, but I don't rejoice. Basically, I just get up in the morning and it just all feels like grey. It all feels heavy. God doesn't have a very cheerful message in the early modern times for that sort of person either. You're miserable because in your heart you're not one of the chosen. And so at the end of your miserable life, you too will go to hell and burn for eternity. Okay? This is a pretty negative sort of message that people are getting, all right? Now, we did talk about Bunyan last week and how, he seemed to make particular negative kinds of choices in terms of which parts of the Bible he looked at and how. But he was in a society that was looking at things. Many people were looking at things in that way. Not everybody. There were some people who said, I don't believe in any of that anyway. But it was pretty dangerous to be an atheist in those days, and so people wouldn't speak up and say they didn't believe in it. But obviously people went to the pub and people went to the theatre and people had a good time, and other people went hunting and shooting and didn't think too much about all of this. But as I said, those churches were the centre of every community and they were filled every week. So it would be a big part of people's lives. So the early modern Protestants had a theological system that didn't really give people very much comfort. Psychologically, it was quite damaging because either people were suffering, the only way through it was to be suffering and rejoicing to suffer, like that woman giving birth whose diary we looked at last week. And that's a pretty tough order, isn't it? It's pretty difficult to live up to that kind of. So this raises the whole spectre of mental suffering, which starts to get talked about in this period for, well, not the first time. People have talked about it through history, but Alec Ryrie, who wrote a book called being Protestant in early modern England, I think it is, or being Protestant in 17th century England. Yeah, being Protestant in 17th century England. I met him. He's got a nice sense of humour, and I like the bit in the front of the book, in the kind of introduction to the book. He says that he went to the zoo, and he heard a little boy talking to his daddy about the bear inside the cage, and he said, "What does the bear do?" You know, and he said, "Well, the bear sort of lives in its cage, and it has meal times, and it comes and eats at meal times." And the little boy said, "Yes, but what does it do all day?" And he said, "That's what I want to do for the Protestant, the early modern. I want to explain what the early modern Protestant did all day. How did they spend their lives? How did they spend their time?" And he wrote a very good book on all of this, and he particularly picks out this aspect of psychological suffering that people went through. Almost everybody, he says, suffered some kind of depression at some time or another in that situation, because you've got what he calls a culture of despair. He gives the example of a diary, the diary of Nehemiah Wallington. His traumas have become symbolic of Protestantism's self-destructive emotional life. So it's really I mean, he's being disrespectful. I don't think he's trying to attack the religion or anything. I think he's just pointing out that it caused people a lot of trauma. It was not an easy choice to make, to take all of this seriously. And the roots of this kind of despair, as he puts it, Ryrie puts it, lie in the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. And so it's no accident, really, that you've got that Anatomy of Melancholy, the first book on, it's not psychology in the Freudian sense, but he's moving into a direction of trying to understand what is happiness, what is unhappiness, what makes us happy and unhappy in this world. And it was published at a time when large numbers of Protestants were haunted by the fear that they might be irrecoverably damned. And many people, at least sometimes, were absolutely convinced that they were. Again, Bunyan, a bit later than this period, but Bunyan as being an example of that. Somebody who's spending his whole life worrying about it. Am I saved or am I damned? Am I going to go to heaven or am I going to go to hell? And part of this came from the way people felt when they were in physical pain. And as we saw last week, people would be in physical pain almost inevitably at some stage in their life. They were going to suffer fairly severe physical pain because there was no way out of it. Just going to the dentist would be an agonizing experience. Having a child, which most women would go through, would be not only painful for many of them, but dangerous, and mortality was quite high. People would die. And some of those people would be able to feel, this sense of, yeah, I can handle this, and thank you, God, for giving me the chance to do it, But for an awful lot of people, they wouldn't really be able to feel like that. So they like Alice Thornton, people like that were blessed, but for a lot of people, it wasn't like that. They would simply be frightened and terrified and just in pain. So, hello, yeah. Here's the Anatomy of Melancholy. All right, Burton's book, which is, he doesn't give his correct name. He calls it Democritus Junior, but it's Burton's very, very famous work, and it picks out on the frontispiece here. It picks out several particular types of causes of melancholy, reasons why people got sad. Melancholy simply being the word that they use for depression, basically. We don't say melancholy very much today. We use the word depression more often. So that jealousy, sorry, the pictures get a bit fuzzy when I expand them, but jealousy was one of them. That would make people unhappy. A cause of unhappiness would be jealousy. solitude, okay, loneliness. All right. I mean, he's actually quite prescient. He anticipates a lot of the things of our modern world, that in spite of being surrounded by others, we feel lonely. And it's a cause of unhappiness. Love, all right? The person who's in love, but it's, love was actually regarded by the ancient Greeks as a sickness. Okay? And the early modern period inherited some of that view, all right? It's a kind of sickness. You're best when you get over it, all right? Either you get married and you get over it that way, because you find out that that's actually just just another person, or you fall out of love. But if you stay in that state of love, you're in a state of sickness, according to the Greeks. And for Burton as well, it's something that makes people unhappy. Hypochondria was the belief that you were ill when you weren't really ill, or the obsessive concern with your health, and worrying that you were ill, worrying whether you were ill, wondering if there was something wrong with you all the time, and kind of being overprotective about your health. And of course, people, I can't go outside today, it's raining, I'll have to stay indoors, and I need the fire lit. And they become miserable old people, don't they, when they start thinking like that, They go out and it doesn't matter if you get a drop of rain on you, what the heck, But they're not like that. And so they make themselves miserable. And superstition. And notice that he shows a Jesuit or a Catholic praying. So his idea of making superstition is actually Catholicism. All right, Catholicism makes you unhappy, but inside the book he does admit, well, Protestantism makes you unhappy too. Right? He does kind of go into that, and he accepts that Protestants haven't got a very positive theology either, but superstition makes you unhappy. It's almost as close as anybody in that period would dare to go to criticizing religion, but he has to make out like it's Catholicism rather than Protestantism. But inside the contents of the book, quite a lot of what he says applies also to Protestantism. And madness, I'm not sure if he's right about that. Some people are quite happily mad. But obviously, if you're... Given the way they treated people who were mad in those days, they tended to lock them up, put them in chains, treat them as if they were, like animals, dangerous animals. That wouldn't make anybody happy. So clearly, from that point of view, you'd be locked up in those days, usually. So that was another area. And yeah, is that it? Is that those six? I think, yeah, basically. So the reason this is such a significant and important book is because he's not trying to explain the human condition in terms of religion, in terms of providentialism, or God is watching over your life, or God is blessing you or cursing you. No, he looks to medical explanations. He looks to the way people live their lives. He's really sort of moving towards the Enlightenment position of seeing things from a pragmatic point of view, not from a religious worldview. So it's a milestone in that respect. And yeah, as I say, that anticipates the Enlightenment. And the chapter on religious melancholy, well, as we might expect, he identifies the doctrine of predestination as one of the causes of early modern depression. So, that's sort of confirmation from somebody at that time, trying to look at it objectively and coming to the same sorts of conclusions. That quite often people's religion wasn't actually making them happy. And yeah, the most famous melancholic or depressive character in early modern literature, or indeed in all of English literature probably, is Hamlet. And his mental state can be attributed, again, at least partly to this doctrine of predestination. In Hamlet's case, he very famously, in one of his early speeches in the play says, I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, lost all my sense of happiness, foregone all custom of exercises. Notice that he I don't know, have you ever felt miserable? I think when I feel miserable, the best thing is to say, get up and go out and go for a walk, do something. No, it's typical, isn't it? He says, I've forgone all exercise. I don't exercise. I just sit there and you just get more and more miserable. Okay, indeed, it goes so heavily with my disposition that this goodly frame, the earth, seems to me a sterile promontory. This most excellent canopy, the air, look you, this brave o'erhanging firmament, this wonderful world that we live in, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire, why, it appears no other thing to me than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapours. This beautiful world just looks like a miserable place to me. What a piece of work is man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet, to me, what is this quintessence of dust? All right, everything's lost its meaning for him. He's living this kind of empty shell of a life. The ostensible reason, the apparent reason, is that he's upset because his father has died, but it goes a lot deeper than that. The play has a lot of references to the next life, what's going to happen after we die. In that sleep of death, what dreams may come. Okay, the sleep of death. The very famous to be or not to be speech. He says, to die, to sleep. And, when we sleep, well, that's great. What's wrong with that? We just sleep. That's great. It's the end of our lives. Just like at the end of the day, we go to bed and we sleep. At the end of our lives, we die and we sleep. Great. But in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. All right. So you could, in your sleep of death, you could be in the dream of heaven, or you could be in the dream of hell. You could be living an eternal nightmare. All right. That is something to think about. That gives us pause. And the question of how we can prepare to meet our fate. The readiness is all. Okay, which I think I mentioned before as being sort of biblical. Really, you can't do it. You can't do anything about your fate. You simply have to try and be there, ready at any time for your fate to kind of come and claim you. Death will come and claim you. From the time, by mistake, he kills Polonius, thinking he's a king, as we, I think, saw before. And this is what condemns him, really. He's destined for hell. But which comes first? Is his fate determined even before is it his action of killing Polonius that condemns him to hell? Or is it the other way round? Okay? He's not condemned because he kills Polonius. He kills Polonius because he's condemned. All right? He's already condemned. It's his fate. And so, therefore, he kills Polonius. Therefore, he kills the king. Okay? What makes Shakespeare great is that he leaves these questions open, as with Macbeth, as we saw before. Okay? But these are the kinds of questions that this period is asking again and again, and they come up in early modern literature kind of so frequently that it's kind of like an obsession. Now I want to look at how this works out politically, because you've got a whole culture that's based on this, and the politics of the time are very awake to this situation. I can't go into too much detail, but the political rhetoric, given that people, were taught that suffering was good for them, it makes it very easy for the controlling political class to say, well, look, we're just helping you to go to heaven. I mean, what are you complaining for? So that imposing suffering on them, abusing the citizens, basically, politically, they could justify it and say, yeah, but it's all part of your golden path to heaven. So don't complain about it. And there's quite a good book on that called Erotic Subjects, The Sexuality of Politics in Early Modern English Literature. She writes, subjects know, Melissa Sanchez, the author, she writes, subjects know that they're being abused, but they tolerate affliction because they enjoy the moral authority it gives them. Okay? They feel strong, they feel, you know, I'm following God's path, just like Bunyan felt great when he was in prison. Okay? Because he finally thought, I'm doing something right. I'm suffering for my faith. So making the ordinary citizen suffer gave the ordinary citizen a sense of moral authority. And the suffering of women was particularly important in this context. The bravery of the female martyrs like Anne Askew and Alice. Who am I talking about? I can't remember now. Anne Askew, Alice. I've forgotten to put in her Myorji, her family name. I can't remember who. Mind has gone blank. Anyway, she was held up. They were held up as examples to the political, typically the male political subject, but to any political subject. The abject, feminized figure of the martyr was the model to which the virtuous male subject ought to aspire. So, to be a true man, you had to suffer like a woman. But then we're moving now into sort of gender aspects of the whole subject, which is a big field in itself, and that's what really Sanchez is dealing with in her book. Alice. It worries me that I can't think of her name. Alice, what was it? I'll check it later. Psychological suffering was not just religious, not just psychological, but it had a political aspect to it. So women were held up as examples of how to face suffering, how to accept suffering. You get things like Andrew Kingsmill saying, call to your remembrance that faithful woman and worthy martyr of Jesus Christ, your own countrywoman, Anne Askew. Her imprisonment moved her not. She little weighed the cruel torture and tearing her body on the rack. She joyfully went to the fire, and was of more comfort in feeling the pain and less weary thereof than the lookers on to behold or the tormentors to do execution. She accepted it all better than the people who actually did it, or better than the people who were looking on. They all found it very difficult, but for her, because she was such a great and courageous person, she could go through all of that easily. And this sort of shaming men for not being able to do that was it's something. It's not just it's not something just in Protestant England. I picked it out particularly in its English Protestant context, but here we've got it in an Italian Catholic context as well, with Girolamo Cardano in Italy. A shame it were that women should for fortitude exceed men. Whosoever falleth into sickness, either willingly or against his will, will he not be ashamed that women should excel him in patience and sufferance of grief? For women, in bearing of children, do endure most extreme pains, yet notwithstanding do not refrain the company of men, and such as be barren do not desire anything so much as to have children, even though they know it's going to hurt, or it's likely to hurt when they have a child. They don't say, well, I'm not going to get pregnant then. And those who, the ones who can't get pregnant, the one thing they want is to be able. I want to be able to have children. Okay, so the grief that women suffer in childing is of all other the greatest and nearest to death. Yea, many of such grief do die indeed. Now he's not putting it so much in a political context. He's saying, when you're ill, you should be patient and suffer it patiently. But the idea, that if you can't suffer like a woman, you're not really a man, was sort of quite strong. You find it cropping up in different European contexts at this time. So Cardano was inside the Catholic tradition, and so for both Catholics and Protestants, the woman's suffering in childbirth was an important symbol of their patience, their fortitude, their bravery, and it's basically biblical. The origin is, well, there are several references, but one of the clearest ones is in the Gospel according to St. John, chapter 16. A woman, when she is in travail, meaning when she's in childbirth, hath sorrow, because her hour is come. But as soon as she's delivered of the child, she remembereth no more the anguish for joy that a man is born into the world. And ye now, therefore, have sorrow. So he's comparing our life in this world to that of a woman before she gives birth, or when she's giving birth to a baby. After the baby's born, she forgets all her sorrow and pain. Just the same message is, after you die and go to heaven, you won't think about the sorrows in this world anymore. All right, so just accept it for now, because it's going to be wonderful afterwards. Okay, now I'm going to wind this up. The sort of last part of this analysis is the way that the Protestants looked at the Catholic suffering. We've seen that Protestant suffering and Catholic suffering were different. The way the Protestants looked at that Catholic suffering was particularly, I think it really changed our attitude. We said at the beginning that you know, like suffering, heck, we don't talk about that in our world. You know, so what changed things? And I think probably it was the way that the Protestants attacked the Catholics for their attitude towards suffering that that led to the kind of, or in part at least, led to the modern taboo on the whole topic. So the Catholic view of suffering was very different. As we said, you know, they used the Vulgate translation of the Bible that had its idea of penance, which included sort of punishing the body in various ways. So you had these penitential practices in Catholic ritual, and the Protestants looked down on them because they thought that practices like that were a misunderstanding of what the Bible really wanted people to do. It didn't really want people to be punishing themselves in that kind of way. So naturally, Protestants attacked Catholics for that kind of practice. These kinds of religious attacks are called polemic or polemical attacks. Religious polemic is using religion and religious arguments to attack another group. Okay, and this usually in the European context, it's Protestants attacking Catholics or Catholics attacking Protestants. That kind of religious discourse is called polemic. So you get, for example, a Protestant writer saying to impatience belongs complaining or grumbling in affliction as if they were undeserved, and softness. Hypocritical patience is perceived in them who torture themselves, as the priests of Baal did in the Old Testament. And they were criticized for doing it in the Old Testament. And the eremites, the whippers, etc. The stoical apathy is rejected. We don't accept this stoical idea where you're actually kind of punishing yourself physically, because patience can well consist with the sense of pains, with mourning and complaints, if so be we do not murmur against God, and that our complaints be rather for our sins than for our sufferings. We're complaining in the wrong kind of way. And the same writer, yes, I've just put his words here. You can see it more clearly. The eremites, the whippers, etc. The social apathy, the stoical apathy is rejected. So basically, attacking the Catholic point of view, they've got it wrong. And even though this Protestant approach to the whole problem causes quite a lot of psychological stress, there's no going back. The Protestants are never going to go back to that acting out, punishing themselves. They're not going to go back to the Catholic way of doing things. condemnation of the Catholic whippers was too strong, too universal for English society ever to return to such practices. They were, you know, the path had divided, and the Catholic path was different from the Protestant one. And the Protestants were always going to attack the Catholics, and the Catholics were, they just had this polemic going on between them. So they weren't going to get back to the way they'd been doing things before. Now, what sort of polemic, what sort of attacks did they make? During the early part of the 17th century, those attacks usually took the form of laughing at them for imposing on themselves penalties they knew in their hearts. That is to say that they knew in their hearts that they deserved. So that's like saying that they underwent penances because that was because they knew that they were bad. And the badness could be seen as evidence that the Catholic path was the wrong path. So the Catholics would be punishing themselves. It would be that kind of, I know I'm a bad boy. I should punish myself. I know I'm a bad boy. They are bad boys. They are naughty boys. They should punish themselves, would be the Protestant attack. Okay, that would be the way the Protestants would ridicule and look at the Catholic practices. That's how they see it. But that's the way they looked at it in the early part of the 17th century. So the typical view was, yeah, they should punish themselves because they are bad boys. Those Catholics, they are bad, so they should punish themselves. It's kind of saying it's very suitable that they should punish themselves in that way. As the century goes on and you get to the later part of the 17th century, it changes. The attacks change. The attacks become more like, they're not just they're going the wrong path. They're actually, it's perverse. What they're doing is perverse. They're sort of, it's a sort of wicked hypocrisy because it's, well, they start to see it. They didn't have the word masochism. They didn't have the idea of it in quite the same way as we have now. But they did have an early modern identity, sexual identity, which was known as the flogging cully. So the early modern prostitution included, a kind of whipping process. And so they started to say, that's what the Catholics really are. They're sexual perverts. Okay, so they're starting to push the Catholic penances into the area of sexual perversion. So you get, for example, a little poem like this: "In came a ghastly shape, all pale and thin, as some but poor sinner who by priest had been, under a long Lent's penance, starved and whipped." And then, came in like a Catholic that's been punished for being naughty. Or, the same sort of thing, like some parboiled lecher late from hothouse crept, some sexual pervert who's just come from being whipped, basically. So you see the attacks on the Catholics now start to become kind of sexual in nature. And that clearly pushes the whole idea of suffering, that kind of suffering, into a taboo corner, which is where we are today with it, really. I mean, obviously other things have gone on, like anesthetics mean that we don't have to suffer in the way that Pepys suffered, if we're in pain and so on. So other things have happened as well, but I think that's quite an important part of it, the way that the Protestants attacked the Catholics over that aspect of their religious practices, their penances. So, the modern taboo on suffering can be traced, at least partly, to this difference between the Catholic approach to suffering and the Protestant approach. Okay, so just wind that up with some simple conclusions. Very often we find that art comes before text. So you can find things, I think I gave an example again of this last week. You can find things going on in pictures before they start to become written down. And so this is a medieval painting from the 15th century, and it's got all those kinds of nuances, hasn't it, really? Of sort of, it's a religious thing. Actually, I don't know if I say that it's actually this is St. Jerome, Okay, this is St. Jerome dreaming that he is being beaten by angels with Christ looking on. And the way that they, she's got her hands sort of, behind her, sort of talking, or not quite, her hands a little bit lower, but it's almost like she's talking behind her mouth talking behind her hand about him, mocking him. The whole setup there is it sort of anticipates that way of looking at Catholic suffering, that it's got a sexual dimension. And again, he's looking back to say, "Are you looking? Can you see?" Okay, it's got all those sort of funny little sexual innuendos going on in it. So, yeah, just to wind it up then. In the early 17th century, you've still got quite a lot of people in English society who are practicing secret kind of penances. And they don't really seem to have thought about it as, in a sexual context particularly. I think people still saw it as a religious action. But when you get this public prohibition on penitential practices, that seems to increase the angst, the psychological stress, because people have to patiently endure the suffering imposed on them by the government or by their circumstances. They're not supposed to complain about their suffering because that's supposed to be something that God's chosen for them. And so, particularly the difficulty of not just you're chosen to, you should rejoice because you've been chosen to suffer, it is a particular source of anxiety, because people who couldn't rejoice were just, they felt, oh, I'm doomed, I'm going to go to hell. And Catholic polemic, that is, attack on the Protestant, on the Catholics by the Protestants, should really say anti-Catholic polemic, seems to have been instrumental in the rise of the perception of cruelty and suffering as being both psychologically and sexually perverse. So basically, the way I tried to understand how suffering attitudes towards suffering have changed over the early modern period, a large part of it comes through the Protestant Catholic polemic, also connected with the dynamic of a society that says you should be proud to suffer, you should be happy to suffer. You've got the government kind of telling you this, which eventually gives way. It can't last. It's too stressful. And by the end of the 17th century, it's more or less ended. And that kind of way of thinking is part of history. And again, we can see that in the move away from Stoic values, which we talked about last week, towards Epicurean values. It's okay. It's okay to have a good time. It's okay to enjoy this life. You don't have to be suffering all the time, or trying to sort of find environments in which it's legitimate to suffer. So, yeah, basically that's it, really. Okay. As I say, I'll sort of, after the presentation, we'll do a bit of talking, looking at the issue in a slightly larger context that I hope is going to help you to understand it in a more general way. But that, for now,